Why did he laugh? And why did everyone else suddenly go silent? The morning sun had barely crawled above the perimeter walls, bleeding gold over the dust-stained concrete when it happened. A single, careless gesture. A crooked finger pointing too close, too familiar, towards someone most men on base avoided mocking. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She just stood there, boots planted on the gritty earth, rifle slung low, her eyes hidden behind the dull glass of regulation-issue shades. But the silence that followed told everyone that the air had shifted. They had seen her temper before. They had whispered about the scars they'd never seen beneath the uniform. And yet, they still underestimated her. "Lighten up, Rivera," one of them said, laughing through his teeth. "It's just a joke." But jokes stop being jokes when they cross a line drawn in blood. Her name was Elena Rivera. Rank, Staff Sergeant. Unit, 51st Security Response Team, Forward Operating Post Delta 19. Most of the new recruits didn't know her story, and those who did refused to speak of it aloud. They just knew that she had been here longer than anyone else, longer even than the men who outranked her. They also knew she was different, too calm when chaos erupted, too quiet in a place where everyone filled silence with noise. No one asked why. Maybe they were afraid of the answer. That morning she was on guard rotation near the outer gate, the one that faced the hills, a stretch of wind-carved ridges where the enemy wasn't supposed to be. Patrol reports said the zone was cold, but Rivera never trusted reports. Reports didn't bleed. "Hey, Sergeant Sirius," the same voice called out again. Private Geller, young, cocky, born without the instinct to shut up. He mimicked her rigid stance, chin lifted, eyes narrowed in exaggerated seriousness. Then he did it, that small, almost imperceptible motion. He jabbed a finger toward her chest, too close for comfort, too close for mockery. The laugh that followed was high and sharp, the kind of laugh people use when they're sure nothing can touch them. But something did. Rivera's hand shot up, lightning fast, clamping around his wrist mid-gesture. It wasn't hard enough to hurt. Not yet. But the pressure was enough to drain the color from his face. "Rule number 1, she said quietly. Her voice carried no anger, just steel. Never point at something you're not prepared to fight. He swallowed, the smirk fading. Around them the other soldiers had fallen silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. It was just a second, a flicker, but in that second they saw something in her eyes. Not rage, not pride, something older, something heavier. No one asked her about the incident, not officially. It was written off as a training moment, filed away in the endless stack of daily reports, but whispers spread as they always did. "Did you see her face? She looked like she was somewhere else. Maybe she overreacted." Overreacted. The word clung to her like sand on sweat. That night she lay on her cot staring at the corrugated ceiling of the barracks. Sleep wouldn't come. It never did on nights like this. Her hand still remembered the feel of Geller's wrist. Her chest still remembered the jolt of memory it triggered. Fingers pointing, laughter, then screaming. It had been years, but the memory hadn't dulled. Kabul, 2017. A street market. A child no older than 8 holding a basket of fruit, and a man older, desperate, pointing at her the same way Geller had. Only that man's finger hadn't stopped in the air. It had curved around the trigger of a hidden detonator. The blast took 4 of her team. It took the sound out of her left ear for almost a year. And it took something else too, something she never got back. Her trust. Morning came again, dry and blinding. The base was awake before the sun, as always, vehicles rumbling, boots marching, radios crackling with half-understood chatter. Rivera suited up in silence. Today wasn't a routine patrol. Today there was a briefing, and briefings meant change. "Operation Shepherd's Eye," Major Kent said, packing before the assembled squad. "Intel reports increased movement near Sector 9. We believe a convoy carrying high-value munitions is scheduled to pass through within 72 hours. Our job is to intercept and secure before it crosses the border. The map behind him was covered in lines and markers, terrain, possible ambush points, fallback zones. Rivera studied it without blinking. She had been on enough missions to know the map always lied. "You'll move as a two-unit team," Kent continued. "Alpha will take the ridge position. Bravo will sweep the low route. Rivera, you'll lead Alpha." A murmur rippled through the room. Alpha meant Overwatch. Overwatch meant sniper eyes, and sniper eyes meant trust. Some of them still weren't sure they trusted her. After the briefing, as they filed out, Geller lingered near the door. He didn't speak, just gave a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement. Rivera returned it with a glance. Nothing more needed to be said. 2 days later, the hills were alive with silence. The convoy route stretched like a scar through the valley, narrow and treacherous, flanked by jagged rock and skeletal trees. Rivera's team moved in the pre-dawn haze, gear heavy, breaths shallow. "Alpha in position," whispered Corporal Singh into the comm. Rivera adjusted the scope of her M110, glassing the far edge of the valley. Heat shimmered in the early light. Nothing moved. Yet. "Bravo moving," came another voice. "ETA 7 minutes." Her heart beat steady, not fast, not slow, just steady. The kind of rhythm born from repetition and scars. But beneath that steadiness was something else. That same weight. That same memory. She scanned the ridgeline again, pausing on a patch of disturbed dust, barely visible but not natural. "Tripwire," she murmured. "Copy," Singh replied, marking it. They worked like shadows, every movement deliberate. Rivera's eyes flicked between the valley and her watch. The convoy was late. That never meant anything good. "Contact west approach," Bravo's voice suddenly cut through. "3 vehicles, civilian models, but they're not slowing." Rivera's pulse kicked. Civilian, that could mean decoy, or worse. "Hold fire," she ordered. "Wait for confirmation." The first vehicle hit the choke point. No insignia, no escorts, just 4 men inside, too calm, too clean. Then she saw it, the glint, small, metallic, nestled in the passenger's lap. "Device," she hissed. "Rules of engagement," Singh asked. Rivera breathed once, twice. Her finger rested on the trigger guard. "Engage." The shot broke the valley's silence. 1 round, clean, controlled. The passenger slumped before he could blink. Chaos erupted, doors flew open, figures scrambled. Return fire cracked against stone. Rivera adjusted, exhaled, and fired again. And again. Each pull of the trigger was a memory, a name, a face, a promise she had made to ghosts long gone. Then it was over. Smoke drifted through the valley. Bravo secured the scene, 3 detainees alive, 1 device disarmed, no friendly casualties. It was, by every definition, a successful operation. But victory never felt like victory to Rivera. That night she stood alone on the perimeter wall, watching the sun burn itself out beyond the hills. Singh approached quietly, 2 mugs of bitter instant coffee in hand. "Hell of a shot today," he said. She didn't answer. "Geller been talking," he added. "Says he's sorry, says he didn't know." "He doesn't need to be sorry," she replied. "He just needs to learn." Singh nodded. They stood in silence, the desert wind tugging at their sleeves. "Do you ever stop thinking about it?" he asked finally. Rivera looked out toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those hills, a boy was still laughing. Somewhere beyond them, 4 names still echoed in the dark. "No," she said, "and I don't want to." The incident with Geller was already fatting from the base rumor mill. New stories replaced old ones. New jokes took the place of silence. But some moments stayed, etched into the fabric of the unit, into the rhythm of their days. And though no one spoke of it, everyone remembered the lesson. Mockery ends where memory begins. Rivera didn't ask for respect. She didn't need it handed to her. She earned it 1 breath, 1 choice, 1 shot at a time. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars and the silence, she knew something most of them didn't. Dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It simply stands its ground, and when the time comes, it acts. Why was the desert so quiet when her heart refused to be? 3 days had passed since the convoy ambush, and yet Elena Rivera could still hear the echo of that single shot in her sleep. The shot that saved lives. The shot that ended one. It replayed behind her closed eyes, not the recoil or the scream, but the silence that followed. A silence too heavy for victory. She had been through dozens of operations before. Clean missions, messy missions, missions that never made it past the debrief room. And every time she told herself the same thing, it's just the job. But this one clung to her bones like desert dust. Rivera. She blinked back to the present. Major Kent's voice carried across the courtyard, firm but not unkind. He stood by the command post door, waving her in. Inside, the room smelled of stale coffee and old decisions. A digital map flickered on the wall, shifting dots, pools and grids. The heartbeat of a war no one wanted to admit was endless. "Take a seat," Kent said. "We need to talk." The conversation was not about commendations, though she'd earned one. It wasn't about the shot either, the one that neutralized a bomb before it could erase an entire patrol. It was about the aftermath. "Intel confirms the convoy was a front," Kent began. "We've linked the cargo to an armed cell operating out of the lowlands. But here, where it gets complicated." He tapped the screen. A grainy satellite image zoomed in on a cluster of buildings stitched together like patchwork. This compound, hidden beneath a textile facility, local source claims it's where they're storing the next wave of ordnance, possibly even chemical payloads. Rivera's eyes narrowed. Source reliable. Kent sighed, reliable enough to act on. He looked at her, really looked. "We're assembling a team. Small, surgical. No air cover, no heavy armor. Stealth in, confirm the intel, neutralize the threat if it's real. I want you on Overwatch." There it was again, that word, Overwatch. A simple assignment, but it meant more than they knew. It meant trust. It meant that after everything, the scars, the whispers, the doubts, they still believed she was the one they wanted watching their backs. "When?" she asked. 48 hours. The next 2 days blurred into preparation. Rivera checked and rechecked every piece of her gear. Optics, suppressors, field rations, water purification tablets. Every gram mattered when you might have to crawl 3 kilometers through sand and silence. But beneath the mechanical rhythm of readiness, something else gnawed at her. It wasn't fear. She had made peace with fear long ago. It was something subtler, more corrosive. Doubt. Not in herself, in the mission. The location. The intel. The source. "Why now?" she asked Singh quietly that night as they cleaned their rifles in the armory. "Why suddenly this lead?" He shrugged. "Command says the window's narrow. If we don't move, someone else will. And if it's bait, then we improvise." He smiled faintly, "like always." Rivera didn't smile back. Improvisation was the polite word for chaos. The team moved before dawn. 5 souls swallowed by the desert, Rivera on Overwatch, Singh and Geller on breach, and 2 new faces from an intelligence unit attached to the base. They rode silent and low, the hum of the transport drowned by the breathless wind. By sunrise, they were 2 clicks from the target zone. They abandoned the vehicle and split, Bravo to approach on foot, Rivera breaking away toward the high ground. The climb was brutal. Loose shale crumbled beneath her boots, the slope steep and unforgiving. But she climbed without complaint, her breath steady, her mind colder than the metal of the rifle strapped to her back. At the crest, the world unfolded beneath her scope. The textile facility was smaller than she'd imagined, weather-worn walls, trucks parked under frayed tarps, a handful of guards smoking on the rooftop. To any passing drone, it looked like nothing. To her, it looked wrong. Too few sentries, too regular a patrol pattern, too quiet. "Alpha in position," she whispered. "Copy moving." Singh's voice came back, faint through the static. The first hour was uneventful. The team inched closer, sweeping for traps, scanning for movement. Rivera watched through glass, marking positions, counting footsteps. Then a flicker. A sliver of light in a window, not sunlight, not glass. Movement, a reflection off a lens. "Hold," her voice was ice. "Second floor window, north corner, possible overwatch." The patrol froze mid-step. Jeller pressed against a wall. Singh signaled a halt. "Do you have eyes?" Singh asked. "Negative, it's gone." A minute crawled by, then two. The window remained empty. Still, Rivera's gut twisted. She trusted her eyes more than any sensor on base, and her eyes had seen a threat. "Proceed with caution," she ordered. "This doesn't feel clean." They breached the outer wall without resistance. No alarms, no shots fired. Too easy. "Main building clear," Jeller reported. "Approaching sub-level access." Rivera swept the scope again. Still nothing. No guards scrambling, no reinforcements. It was as if the place was already abandoned. Then, faint and distant, she heard it. Clicking. Not through comms, not through her scope, through the wind itself. A sound only someone who'd lived too long in war would notice. "Singh, pull back," she hissed. "Now." "Negative, we're almost." The explosion swallowed his voice. A plume of dust erupted from the compound's northern edge, sending debris skyward. Rivera's chest tightened as she scanned for movement, for survivors, for anything. "Bravo status," she barked. "Static." "Singh, report." More static. Then a cough, choked, weak. "Breach compromised," Jeller gasped. "Secondary charges, Singh's hit. I repeat, Singh is down." "Evac, fall back to rally," Rivera ordered. "Can't, too much debris. We're pinned." Her heart pounded against her ribs. She scanned the rooftops again, and this time she saw them. Shapes. Dozens. Emerging from behind the facility, rifles glinting under the rising sun. It wasn't an arms depot. It was a trap. Rivera's world narrowed to a heartbeat and a trigger pull. She adjusted windage, dialed in distance, and squeezed. One target dropped, then another, and another. "Bravo, suppressive fire," she called. "We're trying," Jeller's voice was ragged. "Singh's bleeding out." "Stay with me, I'll get you out." She shifted position, crawling toward a better angle. Her fingers trembled not from fear, but from the unbearable clarity of déjà vu. She had been here before. Kabul, the market, the finger, the blast. Not again. "Command, this is Alpha 1, she shouted into the comm. "We have an ambush at Grid Echo 95. Immediate QRF required." "Copy, Alpha 1. QRF en route. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes, an eternity. Singh didn't have 20 minutes. Time distorted into fragments. She dropped another attacker, then another. The air stank of cordite and blood. Her shoulder ached from recoil, her vision blurred with sweat. "Rivera," Jeller's voice cracked. "We're losing him." "Hold pressure, don't you let him go." She lined up another shot. The target ducked. She shifted again, found a second shooter, fired. Through it all, Singh's breathing faint, shallow, slipping away, echoed in her headset. She had sworn she would never lose another teammate. She had promised herself Kabul would be the last time. And now, history was writing itself again, the same ink, the same page, just a different name. "Stay awake, Singh," she whispered. "Stay with me." Minutes felt like centuries before the low thrum of rotor blades rolled over the ridge. QRF inbound. Gunships swept the compound, cutting through the ambush with terrifying precision. When the dust finally settled, the enemy had vanished into the hills. The facility was rubble, and Singh was barely breathing. Rivera sprinted down from Overwatch, her knees buckling as she reached the breach site. Jeller knelt beside the wounded sergeant, his hands soaked crimson. "He's still with us," he said, voice shaking. "Barely." Rivera dropped to her knees, pressing her hand over Singh's. "You hear me?" she whispered. "You're not going anywhere, not today." His eyes flickered a ghost of a smile. "Told you we'd improvise." Then they closed. Back at base, the medics worked for hours. Singh survived, but the damage was severe. Nerve trauma, shrapnel lodged near the spine. The doctors couldn't promise he'd walk again. Rivera stood outside the infirmary, helmet still on, rifle still slung. She hadn't moved since they brought him in. Geller approached quietly, his arm in a sling. "They say it's not your fault." She didn't respond. It was a setup. Intel was bad. None of us saw it coming. "I did," she murmured. "I saw something, and I ignored it." "You warned us." "Not hard enough." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. "Singh wouldn't blame you," Geller said at last. "That's the problem," Rivera whispered. "He should." Night fell, the base slept. Rivera didn't. She walked the perimeter alone, boots crunching against gravel, eyes scanning the horizon as if the desert itself might answer the questions clawing at her chest. Was this who she was destined to be? The soldier who survived while others paid the price? The protector who couldn't protect? Somewhere deep inside, beneath the guilt and the fury and the quiet ache of failure, a seed of resolve took root. She couldn't change what happened to Singh, but she could make sure it never happened again. No more traps. No more surprises. No more funerals. If the war wanted to take her people, it would have to go through her first. In the days that followed, the investigation confirmed what Rivera already suspected. The source had been compromised. The intel had been fed to them deliberately, bait on a hook, a message. And buried in that message was something darker, something personal. A name. A symbol. A ghost from her past. It wasn't random. It was never random. The finger that pointed at her in Kabul, the blast that changed her life, the man responsible, he was still alive. And he was calling her out. For the first time in years, Rivera felt something sharper than guilt, something hotter than fear. Hunger. For truth. For justice. For an ending that finally made sense. Why did the name feel heavier than the rifle she carried? Elena Rivera stared at the single sheet of paper spread across the operations table. It wasn't much, just a blurred image from an intercepted drone feed and a code name scrawled in bold across the top. Hassan al-Malik. She knew the name. Everyone did. The ghost behind half the detonations in the southern provinces. The architect of chaos. A man who never showed his face and never left fingerprints. But Rivera knew him for another reason. Because he was the man whose signal detonator ended 4 lives and tore hers apart in Kabul 8 years ago. And now he was reaching out again. "Are you sure?" Singh's voice was thin, barely above a whisper. He lay propped up in the infirmary bed, pale and weak but awake, stubbornly awake. Rivera nodded. "The symbol carved into the wall at the compound matches his cell. It wasn't a coincidence." He exhaled through clenched teeth. "So this isn't over." It never was. Silence. The monitors beeped rhythmically beside him, a cruel reminder of how close he had come to silence forever. "Don't do anything reckless," he said finally. "Don't make this about revenge." Rivera's gaze drifted toward the window, the desert stretching endlessly beyond the wire. "It's not about revenge," she said quietly. "It's about closure." But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed that. A new briefing was called that afternoon. Major Kent paced before the assembled task force, the room heavy with tension. "Al-Malik is no longer just a target of opportunity," he said. "He's escalated. The ambush confirms he's targeting coalition forces directly, and he's growing bolder. Intelligence places him in the borderlands, operating out of a network of safe houses. Our orders are to cut that network apart piece by piece until he has nowhere left to hide. A map flickered to life, red dots marking potential sites. Most were too remote, too fortified. But one stood out, a trading outpost deep in the Al-Qadir Valley. Signals intercept suggests one of his top lieutenants will be present there in 72 hours, Kent continued. It's not Al-Malik himself, but it's the closest we've been in years. Rivera studied the map. The valley was a snake's nest, steep ridges, narrow approaches, no easy exit, a death trap for anyone foolish enough to enter. "Who's leading the op?" she asked. Kent's eyes met hers. "You are." The preparation was different this time. It wasn't just about gear or logistics. It was about intent. Rivera wasn't planning a mission, she was planning a confrontation. She went over every image, every signal intercept, every rumor about Al-Malik's network. The man had spent nearly a decade weaving himself into the shadows. But this time, he'd left a thread hanging, and Rivera intended to pull it until the whole web unraveled. "You're sure about this?" Geller asked as they loaded gear into the transport. He still wore the guilt of Singh's injuries like a second skin. "Yes," Rivera replied. "You're not doing this for him." She paused. "I'm doing this because if we don't stop him now, there will be another Singh, and eventually me." That shut him up. They left under the cover of darkness. 3 vehicles, 12 operators. Rivera's team would infiltrate from the East Ridge while a secondary unit sealed the western escape route. The objective was simple: capture the lieutenant alive, extract intel, and use it to close the noose around Al-Malik's throat. The valley was silent when they arrived, unnaturally so. The moonlight carved sharp edges into the rocks, and the air was thin and cold enough to bite. "Alpha in position," Rivera whispered into the comm. "Bravo moving," came the reply. She lay prone on the ridge, her scope sweeping over the outpost below, a cluster of makeshift huts, a few rusted vehicles, a satellite dish angled toward the stars. She counted 6 guards, then 7, then 9. They moved with purpose, scanning the horizon. Something was off. "Positions seem too rigid," she murmured. "They're expecting someone." "Maybe they know we're coming," Geller said. "No," Rivera said. "They're waiting for someone else." The team crept closer, moving like shadows stitched into the landscape. Geller and 2 others breached the perimeter fence, sliding silently through the gaps. Then a flash. A single flare burst overhead, painting the valley in blood-red light. "Contact," someone shouted over comms. Gunfire erupted, not the wild, chaotic spray of amateurs, but disciplined, coordinated bursts. Rivera's stomach twisted. These weren't militia thugs. This was a professional security detail. "Ambush," Geller yelled. "We're pinned." Rivera's scope snapped toward the sound. 4 hostiles on the north ridge, 3 near the trucks, 2 moving to flank. Her finger danced against the trigger, each shot a heartbeat, each heartbeat a decision. "Fall back to rally," she ordered. "Negative," Geller shouted. "The lieutenant, he's here, I have visual." "Do not pursue, that's an order." But Geller didn't respond. Through the scope, she saw him break from cover and sprint toward a corrugated steel door. A foolish, reckless move, but a human one. She adjusted, breath shallow, covering his advance. 2 hostiles dropped. A third ducked behind debris. Then a figure stepped out from the shadows. Tall, calm, unhurried. And smiling. It wasn't the lieutenant. It was someone far worse. "Al-Malik," Rivera whispered. The man was older than she remembered. His beard streaked with gray, his eyes sharper, colder. But it was him, the ghost, the architect of her nightmares. He looked up toward her position, directly into her scope, and raised a hand. Not a weapon. Not a surrender. A wave. Mocking, casual, familiar. The same hand that had pointed once before, moments before a blast that changed everything. Rage surged through her chest, hot and blinding. Every instinct screamed, take the shot. End it now. End him. Rivera, Kent's voice snapped through the calm. Do not fire. Repeat, do not engage. We need him alive. Her finger trembled on the trigger. Alive? He didn't deserve alive. Rivera, stand down. She closed her eyes. One breath. Two. The weight of the past pressed against her trigger finger, and for a heartbeat, she wasn't on a ridge in Al-Qadir. She was in a Kabul marketplace, watching 4 of her brothers and sisters vanish into fire. Then the decision was gone. Al-Malik vanished behind cover, slipping through a rear exit. The window closed. Jeller, fall back, she barked. But it was too late. The steel door slammed shut, sealing him inside. The outpost exploded into chaos, charges detonating in sequence, collapsing walls, triggering smoke and debris. Evac route compromised, someone shouted, we're cut off. Alpha, regroup on me, Rivera commanded, already breaking position. She scrambled down the ridge, heart hammering. Explosions tore through the valley as the enemy destroyed their own facility. They weren't defending it, they were erasing it. Bravo status. 2 KIA, Jeller's missing, we're pulling back. Rivera's boots slammed against the earth as she sprinted toward the collapsing compound. Heat rolled off the debris. The smoke choked the air, and somewhere inside, Jeller was either alive or not. She refused to let history repeat itself. They found him 30 meters from the blast epicenter, pinned under a collapsed support beam. Alive, but barely. Help me move him, Rivera shouted. 2 soldiers rushed to her side, straining against the twisted metal. It shifted just enough. Jeller gasped, coughing blood. Did you see him? He rasped. Yes. Was it? Yes. His eyes fluttered. Then this isn't over. No, Rivera said, gripping his hand. It's just starting. The mission was officially labeled a failure. The outpost destroyed, the lieutenant dead, Al-Malik gone. They had nothing, no intel, no leads, no proof he was even there. Command wasn't pleased. Words like reckless, undisciplined, and unsanctioned engagement were thrown around. But none of it mattered to Rivera, because she had seen him with her own eyes, and that meant one thing: the ghost wasn't untouchable anymore. She visited Singh that night, his room dim and silent. Jeller was in surgery, his condition uncertain. The cost of the mission weighed heavy in the air. He's alive, she said simply. Singh's expression darkened. Then you know what comes next. Rivera nodded. We find him, no matter how long it takes, no matter where he hides. Command will never authorize it, Singh warned. Then I'll go without authorization. Alone. If I have to. He stared at her for a long moment. You're not doing this for closure anymore. No, she admitted. I'm doing it so no one else ever points at us again. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, quiet, indifferent, ancient. Somewhere beyond it, a man she had sworn to kill was still breathing, still laughing, still pointing. And for the first time in years, Elena Rivera felt alive. Not because the mission had succeeded, but because the hunt had begun. The next move was his. But the ending would be hers. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon when Rivera slipped through the narrow alleyways of Al-Haddar. Her boots were silent against the dusty ground, her rifle wrapped in burlap and cloth to break its silhouette. Every breath was measured, every step deliberate. She was no longer a soldier under orders. She was a ghost chasing a shadow. And in that ghost's chest, a storm raged. No one knew she was here. Not Vega, not Command, not even the few local contacts who still trusted her. This mission, if you could still call it that, wasn't on any map or in any file. It was personal, too personal. He has to pay, she whispered under her breath, the words barely forming sound. The memory of Al-Malik's cold grin burned behind her eyes. She could still see the footage, the convoy torn apart, the screaming civilians, the children. She'd been seconds too late, and that failure carved something deep into her soul. Now she was here to erase it. The city was alive but hollow, a carcass pretending to breathe. Vendors were setting up their stalls, old men sweeping dust from in front of shops that no one entered anymore. Somewhere a child cried, a sound she once would have turned toward. Now she didn't dare. Her entire world narrowed to a single name. Al-Malik. Reports placed him in Al-Haddar 3 days ago, under heavy guard, moving between safe houses. They said he was planning something bigger, something catastrophic, and if she could stop it before it started. Maybe then I'll sleep. She ducked into a doorway as a patrol truck rattled past. Local militia, friendly to him, hostile to anyone else. Rivera held her breath, counting the seconds until they were gone. The hum of the engine faded into silence. She moved again. By mid-morning, she was perched atop a crumbling rooftop near the central square, a sniper's nest she'd found in a forgotten building that smelled of rot and rain. From here, she could watch one of Al-Malik's suspected safe houses. It was an old stone structure with a rusted balcony, guarded by 2 men with mismatched rifles and nervous eyes. They smoked, paced, checked their watches. Amateur but dangerous all the same. Rivera adjusted her scope and waited. Waiting was something she'd learned to love and hate in equal measure. It was in the waiting that doubt crept in, whispering questions she couldn't ignore. What if he's not here? What if you're wrong? What if this is all just revenge, not justice? She exhaled slowly, silencing the noise. Focus, breathe, watch. Hours passed. The heat grew unbearable. Sweat dripped down her temple, but she didn't move. She'd become a statue, a predator carved from patience. And then movement. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, dust curling around its tires. 4 armed men stepped out first, scanning the street. Then a figure in a long coat emerged. Rivera's heart slammed against her ribs. It was him. Even from this distance, she recognized that arrogant gait, the way he didn't bother to look around. Al-Malik walked as if the city belonged to him. Maybe, in a way, it did. Her finger brushed the trigger. Just a small squeeze, that's all it would take. But she didn't pull. Not yet. Not here, she muttered under her breath. Too many civilians, too much risk. Her mission wasn't just to kill him. It was to end him, to break the network, to stop whatever he was planning. A bullet here would only create chaos. And chaos meant more bodies. She needed to know what he was planning, where he was going next. So she waited again, eyes tracking his every move. He spoke briefly with one of the guards, then disappeared inside the safe house. The men outside shifted their positions, a subtle sign they were settling in for a long stay. Rivera's plan shifted. She would follow, shadow him, learn his route, and then, when the time was right, strike. 2 nights later, she found her chance. A coded radio intercept, thanks to a stolen transmitter she'd risked her life to plant, revealed that Al-Malik would be on the move. Midnight, South Road, minimal escort. It was the break she needed. Rivera positioned herself on a ridge overlooking the dusty road leading out of Al-Haddar. The moon was thin and distant, the desert wind biting at her exposed skin. She checked her rifle, then her sidearm, then the small explosive charge in her pack. She wasn't here to assassinate, not yet. She was here to capture. Or failing that, destroy. The convoy appeared right on time, 2 vehicles, headlights dimmed, engines whispering. Her heart beat in rhythm with the crunch of their tires. Rivera's breath steadied. Her scope locked on the lead driver. A small burst from her suppressed rifle, the vehicle veered, tires screeching, and slammed into a ditch. The second truck braked hard. Doors flew open. Armed men spilled out, shouting in Arabic, firing wildly into the night. Rivera was already moving. She slid down the ridge, rolling into cover behind a rock outcrop. The firefight was chaotic, muzzle flashes, panic shouts, dust clouds rising. She moved like a phantom, dropping one guard then another. Precision, control, cold focus. But then a click. Her rifle jammed. Rivera cursed under her breath, tossing it aside and drawing her sidearm. She advanced, close and fast. The last man turned too late, a swift kick dropped him. Silence fell. And then she saw him. Al-Malik crawling out of the overturned truck, blood trickling down his face. He locked eyes with her, and for the first time she saw fear. "Don't move," she hissed, gun trained on his chest. He laughed, bitter, defiant. "You think this ends with me, soldier? It ends now." But before she could step closer, a distant rumble shook the ground. Headlights, more vehicles, reinforcements. Too many. She had seconds to decide, kill him and risk capture, or vanish and live to try again. Her finger hovered over the trigger. Do it, end this, right now. But something deep inside held her back, a memory, a voice. Her co's warning, justice isn't about revenge. Don't trade your soul for his blood. She holstered her weapon. With a flashbang tossed to cover her retreat, Rivera melted into the darkness, the desert swallowing her whole as the reinforcements arrived. Hours later, she sat alone in an abandoned fuel station miles outside the city. Her hands trembled as she cleaned her sidearm. Failure gnawed at her. She had him, and she let him go. Was that mercy, she whispered, or weakness? The radio crackled on the floor beside her, a coded message from Vega. They'd intercepted chatter. Al-Malik was furious, and he was moving again, this time toward a border crossing. She closed her eyes, a weary smile tugging at her lips. "This isn't over," she said softly. Somewhere deep inside, a spark of something, not rage, not vengeance, but purpose, began to burn again. The hunt wasn't finished. It had only just begun. Night fell over the desert once more. Rivera packed her gear and rose to her feet, the weight of her choices heavy but necessary. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a reckoning, patient, relentless, inevitable. And this time, Al-Malik wouldn't get away. Not again. To be continued. The desert night stretched endlessly before her, a sea of shadows beneath a pale, merciless moon. Rivera moved through it like a ghost, her footsteps silent, her breath shallow, the weight of failure pressing heavy against her chest. Every mile she put between herself and that abandoned fuel station felt like a confession that she'd hesitated, that she'd let Al-Malik slip through her fingers, again. But there was no time for regret now. The radio message from Vega echoed in her mind, a cold, clipped warning. "He's moving toward the border. You have a narrow window, Rivera. Don't lose him." She adjusted the strap of her pack, tightening it against her shoulders. Her boots crunched softly over gravel and bone-dry sand. The horizon was beginning to pale, dawn was near. And with it, a second chance. The plan was reckless, it always had been. She had no backup, no sanction, no extraction plan. If she was caught here, she'd be disavowed and forgotten. If she was killed, no flag would drape her coffin. This was a ghost's mission, and ghosts did not come home. Still, she pressed on, because this wasn't just about orders anymore. This was about him, about the faces she'd seen in that convoy, about the little girl with the red scarf whose name she'd never learned, whose lifeless eyes still haunted her dreams. This was about redemption, hers and theirs. By sunrise, Rivera had reached the outskirts of a small border town, a place locals called Cara. It was little more than a collection of mud-brick homes, a marketplace, and a worn-out checkpoint that marked the edge of a hostile nation. It was also, according to intercepted chatter, Al-Malik's next stop. She set up on a ridge overlooking the town, pulling a pair of battered binoculars from her pack. Through the dusty lenses, she scanned the streets. Trucks, armed men, too many of them. She felt her pulse quicken. He was here or would be soon. The entire town was bracing for his arrival. Rivera sank lower behind the rocks, wiping a thin sheen of sweat from her brow. Her plan had to change. A direct assault was suicide. But maybe she didn't need to kill him yet. Maybe she could cut off his escape. She pulled a small, folded map from her pocket, a hand-drawn sketch of the town's layout she'd assembled from satellite images and stolen intel. There were two likely routes out of Kara, the main highway to the north, and a narrow smuggler's road winding through the southern hills. If she could rig explosives on one and set an ambush on the other, he'd have nowhere to run. She spent the next several hours moving silently through the outskirts, planting charges in culverts, marking potential sniper nests, memorizing every alley and vantage point. The work was meticulous, the kind of preparation that separated a professional from a martyr. All the while the sun crept higher, baking the earth and stealing moisture from her lungs. By mid-afternoon she was exhausted, her body aching, but the trap was set. Now she waited. The convoy arrived just before dusk, 3 SUVs and a cargo truck, escorted by a pair of technicals mounted with machine guns. Rivera watched them roll into town from her rooftop perch, her scope sweeping across each vehicle. There, the middle SUV, tinted windows, extra armor. Her heartbeat slowed. That was him. She steadied her rifle, breath measured. This time, there was no hesitation. If the shot was clean, she would take it. But then, a flicker of movement below caught her eye. A group of children darted across the street, chasing a deflated soccer ball into the path of the convoy. The lead driver slammed the brakes, shouting at them to get clear. Rivera's trigger finger froze. One wrong shot now, and they'd all die. She lowered her rifle, jaw clenched. Not like this, not again. Al-Malik stepped out moments later, surrounded by bodyguards. Even from a distance, Rivera could see his confidence, the swagger of a man who believed himself untouchable. But she noticed something else too. He wasn't carrying a weapon, and he wasn't heading into a safe house. Instead, he was led into a warehouse on the edge of town, one that was guarded more heavily than anything she'd seen before. What was inside? Curiosity tugged at her instincts. Killing him here would be satisfying, but understanding what he was planning could save hundreds, maybe thousands. And so, for the second time, Rivera made a choice that went against her every impulse. She didn't pull the trigger. She followed. Night fell over Kara like a shroud. Rivera slipped from shadow to shadow, closing in on the warehouse perimeter. The guards were sloppy, overconfident, distracted by cigarettes and conversation. She slipped past them easily, scaling a rusted ladder to a second-floor window. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic tang of oil and gunpowder. She crouched low, peering through the cracked glass, and her breath caught. It wasn't a weapons cache. It was something far worse. Dozens of civilians, men, women, even teenagers, were shackled to the walls and floor. Some wore military uniforms stripped of insignia. Others were plainly locals. All of them looked terrified. And standing in the center of it all was Al-Malik, speaking in a calm, measured voice. "Tonight," he said, "we move them across the border. Tomorrow, their executions will be broadcast to every screen from here to the capital. And then, the world will know who truly holds power." Rivera's stomach turned to ice. It wasn't just about bombs or ambushes. He was building a message, one carved in blood and fear. And she couldn't let that happen. Her original plan was gone. The mission had just changed. It was no longer about eliminating Al-Malik. It was about saving those people. Rivera scanned the room. 20 guards, maybe more. Too many for a frontal assault. But there were weak points, a generator humming by the back wall, a fuel line snaking through the floor, a ventilation duct above the captives. She could use those. Her hand trembled as she unpacked her final charge, a shaped explosive meant for vehicles, now repurposed for chaos. She fixed it to the generator and wired it to a remote detonator. Then she slipped back into the night. She was 300 meters away when the explosion ripped through the warehouse. A bloom of orange and black tore the night open. Screams echoed. Gunfire erupted. Rivera moved fast, cutting down two guards as they stumbled out of the chaos. She kicked open a side door, smoke burning her lungs as she rushed inside. "Move," she shouted to the captives. "Now." Some stared in disbelief. Others obeyed immediately. Chains were torn from bolts, shackles broken. Fear turned into desperate motion. And then gunfire from above. A guard on the catwalk. Rivera dove behind a crate, bullets shredding the space she just occupied. She fired back, her shot dropping him cold. "Go, go," she yelled again. Dozens of prisoners poured into the street, scattering into the darkness. Sirens wailed in the distance. Chaos consumed Kara. But one figure hadn't run. Al-Malik. He stood near the wreckage, coughing through smoke, fury burning in his eyes. He saw her and smiled. "Too late," he rasped. "You can't stop what's coming." Rivera raised her weapon, but before she could fire, an explosion rocked the floor beneath them. The roof groaned. The walls buckled. She stumbled backward, choking on dust. When the smoke cleared, he was gone. Hours later, Rivera stood atop a dune overlooking the burning town. The captives were safe. The mission, if you could call it that, was a success. But victory tasted hollow. He was still out there, and now he knew she was too. A cold wind swept across the desert, carrying with it the faint echo of distant sirens. Rivera watched the flames dance against the horizon, her heart heavy but resolute. "This isn't over," she whispered into the dark. "Not yet." And as the first light of dawn broke once more, she shouldered her rifle and disappeared into the wasteland, a shadow chasing another, determined to finish what she started. The flames still burned long into the night. Rivera stood on that dune until the last orange glow of Kara's chaos faded into the horizon. The cold desert wind swept the sand across her boots, whispering over the dunes like ghosts murmuring stories. Below her, the town that had been a nest of terror hours earlier was now a smoking scar on the earth. She had done what she could, saved the hostages, shattered Al-Malik's spectacle, exposed his cruelty to anyone watching. But the one thing that mattered most had slipped through her fingers again. He was gone. And with every failure, the weight pressing on her chest grew heavier. By the time dawn broke, Rivera was already on the move. She scavenged supplies from an abandoned checkpoint, water, rations, a map crumpled and faded by years of heat. She walked alone along an old smuggler's road, each step a reminder of how far she was willing to go to end this. "He knows who you are now," a voice whispered in the back of her mind. "And that means he'll be ready next time." She ignored it. Doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. Somewhere ahead, Al-Malik was running, and somewhere beyond him, something bigger, darker was coming. He said it himself before disappearing into the fire. "You can't stop what's coming." Rivera replayed those words again and again. They weren't a threat, they were a promise. And promises like that had to be broken. 3 days later, she reached the border. The checkpoint was a forgotten strip of concrete and rusted metal, manned by soldiers who looked more like scavengers than professionals. They didn't care about paperwork or uniforms, just money. A few crumpled bills and a forged ID card were all it took to pass. Once across, the world changed. The roads were better maintained, the villages more prosperous, and the people more cautious. This was Al-Malik's true territory now, not the war-torn chaos she'd known, but a land ruled by fear and silence. Everyone here had seen what happened to those who spoke against him. And that silence told her she was close. Rivera spent the next week tracking whispers. A shipment moving through the mountain passes, A convoy of construction materials guarded by armed men, a mysterious bunker being reinforced deep in the Al-Sefir Valley. Each clue was small, almost insignificant on its own, but together they painted a picture. Al-Malik wasn't hiding anymore. He was preparing for something massive. The pieces began to fit: the hostages, the broadcasts, the movement across borders. This wasn't about one attack or one message. It was a campaign, a calculated push to ignite something far larger than anyone expected. And Rivera knew she had to stop it before it began. One night, as she sat alone in a decaying roadside cafe, a voice broke through the static of her stolen radio. "Ghost, this is Raven." Her heart skipped. It was Vega. "Copy, Raven," she whispered. "I'm still breathing." "You're off the map, Rivera. Command is furious. You've disobeyed direct orders, compromised operations." "Save it," she cut him off. "I'm close." A long pause, then Vega sighed. "I figured as much. Listen, I pulled some strings. There's chatter about a meeting in Al-Sefir in 2 days, high level. Al-Malik's supposed to be there." Her fingers tightened around the receiver. "Coordinates." "Sending now. But listen to me, Rivera. You're alone. If you go in there and something goes wrong, I can't pull you out. No one can." "I was alone the day he burned that convoy," she said quietly. "Nothing's changed." Another silence, then softer, then Godspeed, Ghost. The transmission clicked off. Rivera closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to resolve. This was it, one final chance. Al-Sefir was a scar carved into the mountains, a mining town turned fortress, now controlled entirely by Al-Malik's network. Getting in would be suicide. But Rivera didn't plan to get in. She planned to slip through. The night before the meeting, she moved through the lower valley disguised as a shepherd, her rifle broken down into harmless-looking metal scraps. She avoided checkpoints, bypassed sentries, and crawled through drainage tunnels that smelled of rust and rot. Hours passed. Her hands bled from jagged stone. Her knees ached from the crawl. But by dawn, she was inside the perimeter. From her vantage point in the shadow of an abandoned silo, she scanned the compound below, a sprawling complex of tents, trucks, and satellite dishes. Dozens of armed men patrolled the area. At the center, a reinforced building stood apart from the rest. That was the meeting place. And standing at its entrance, surrounded by his inner circle, was Al-Malik. Rivera steadied her scope, watching him laugh and gesture, the picture of untouchable arrogance. He was thinner now, more cautious, a man who knew he was being hunted, but that same cold confidence still clung to him like armor. She had a clear shot, a perfect one. One squeeze, and this would all be over. But as her finger hovered over the trigger, she saw something that made her heart freeze. It wasn't just Al-Malik and his lieutenants inside. There were others, uniforms, foreign faces, men who did not belong here. This wasn't a warlord's meeting. It was a summit. And if she killed him now, whatever alliance he was forging could still move forward, perhaps even stronger, fueled by vengeance. She lowered the rifle. Not yet. Rivera needed to know who they were, what they were planning. That meant getting closer. She packed up and began moving along the ridge, staying low, silent. At the far edge of the compound, she found what she was looking for: a supply truck parked near a maintenance gate. 2 guards smoked lazily beside it. It took less than a minute to drop them both. Minutes later, Rivera was inside the truck, hidden beneath a tarp as it rolled into the compound. Her heart pounded with every bump and jolt of the road. If they found her, she was dead. But if they did... The truck stopped. Voices shouted orders, doors slammed. Rivera waited until the noise faded, then slipped out into the shadows. Inside the main building, the air was cool and sterile. Conversations echoed down the corridors, Arabic, Russian, English. She followed them deeper, her back pressed to the walls, her steps soundless. Then she heard it, a voice she'd never expected to hear again. She's still alive, the American. It was Al Malik. Rivera pressed herself against the corner, listening. She won't stop, said another voice. We've underestimated her before. Let her come, Al Malik replied calmly. She's a distraction. By the time she reaches us, it will already be too late. What about the device? It's en route 3 days, and then the world will burn. Rivera's blood turned to ice. A device 3 days. This wasn't just an attack. It was something catastrophic. She backed away, her mind racing. She needed proof, something she could transmit to Vega and Command, something that would make them believe her. Then she saw it, a terminal glowing in a side office, its screen filled with shipping manifests and encrypted routes. She slipped inside, plugging a small drive into the port. The download began, seconds ticking by like gunshots in her chest. 30%. 50. 70. A shout echoed down the hall. Boots pounded closer. Check that room. Rivera's heart hammered. 90%, 92, 95. The door burst open. A guard's eyes went wide. You. Rivera moved before he could finish. 2 quick shots, silence. The download hit 100%. She ripped the drive free and bolted for the exit. The compound was in chaos now, alarms blaring, soldiers shouting orders, searchlights cutting through the darkness. Rivera sprinted toward the perimeter, weaving through crates and vehicles, every muscle screaming. Bullets cracked past her. One grazed her shoulder, spinning her sideways. She stumbled, bit down on the pain, and kept running. Stop her! She dove behind a truck as a hail of gunfire shredded the ground where she'd stood. Smoke poured from a burning fuel drum nearby, cloaking the yard in gray haze. Rivera crawled beneath the undercarriage, emerging on the far side just as a spotlight swept past. The gate was 50 meters ahead. 30. 20. A burst of fire slammed into the dirt at her feet. She dove into a ditch, rolled, came up firing. One guard dropped, then another. 10 meters. A roar split the night as a truck screeched around the corner, headlights blinding her. Rivera raised her pistol, emptied the mag into the windshield. The driver slumped, the vehicle swerving and crashing into a wall. She vaulted over the twisted gate and tumbled down the rocky slope beyond. She didn't stop running until the compound was a distant smear of light behind her. Hours later, Rivera crouched in a dry riverbed, panting, blood soaking through the fabric of her sleeve. The flash drive was still in her pocket, warm against her skin, proof of what she'd heard, proof that something catastrophic was coming. She activated her radio. "Raven, this is Ghost," she rasped. "I have intel, high value, you need to see this." Static hissed, then Vega's voice shaken. "Rivera, we thought you were dead." "Not yet," she whispered. "But listen carefully. There's a device, 3 days, I'm sending coordinates now." "Copy that, stand by for exfil." "No," she said, her voice like steel. "I'm not leaving, not until this is over." "Rivera." "Tell Command to get ready," she said, "because the next move is mine." She clicked the radio off and stared out across the moonlit valley. 3 days. That was all the time she had to stop the worst act of terror the region had ever seen. And failure this time was not an option. The desert was colder that night than Rivera remembered. The kind of cold that slipped beneath the fabric of your clothes and pressed against your bones. She crouched in the hollow of the dried riverbed, watching the distant lights of the border station flicker in the dark. 3 days left. 3 days until Al Malik's plan was set into motion, and still she had nothing. No entry point. No backup. No guarantee she'd even live to see the next sunrise. But quitting was never an option. She adjusted the scope of her binoculars, studying the flow of patrols across the perimeter. Two-man teams, rotating every hour, cameras on the north wall, infrared sensors on the south. Whoever built this place hadn't expected an army, but they had built it to stop ghosts. And that's exactly what she had to become. Her mind replayed the last radio intercept. Al-Malik's men were preparing a convoy to cross at dawn 2 days from now. He'd be there in person to oversee the operation. If he slipped into the neighboring territory, he'd vanish for good. This was her last chance. The first part of the plan was simple: get inside. Rivera waited until the moon ducked behind a bank of clouds before moving. She crawled through the sand, keeping low, every breath measured. The ground was rough beneath her palms, littered with stones and shards of old metal. Each step forward was a battle against the urge to sprint. Patience, always patience. Half an hour later, she was at the south wall, a jagged stretch of concrete rising 12 feet high. Infrared sensors swept the ground ahead like invisible serpents. One wrong move and the entire base would light up with alarms. Rivera reached into her pack and pulled out a small emitter, a stolen piece of tech she'd risked her life for weeks earlier. She buried it beneath a mound of sand and activated it. The sensors blinked, then stuttered, and then stopped scanning entirely. She exhaled slowly. "Thank you, Vega," she murmured, thinking of the engineer who'd built it for her back at base. Scaling the wall was the easy part. Years of training turned her movements into instinct. Fingers found cracks, boots dug into grooves. In seconds, she was over, crouched in the shadows on the other side. Now came the hard part. The interior of the compound was eerily quiet. Metal buildings cast long, skeletal shadows beneath dim floodlights. A single guard smoked lazily near the watchtower, his weapon slung over one shoulder. Rivera slipped past him like a whisper, hugging the walls and counting steps between patrols. She'd memorized the satellite imagery, every door, every camera, every blind spot. But what the images couldn't show her was the smell, the acrid mix of oil and gunpowder, or the way the silence pressed down like a weight. It was the kind of place built not just to hold people, but to make them disappear. Rivera's destination was a small admin building near the center of the compound. According to intercepted comms, it housed transport logs that could reveal Al-Malik's exact convoy route. If she had that, she could intercept him before he ever crossed the border. She slipped inside through an unlocked side door. The room was empty, just the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of a generator. Rivera's flashlight swept across rows of filing cabinets and stacks of paper, and then froze on a terminal glowing faintly in the corner. "Come on," she whispered, plugging in her data drive. The screen flickered, password protected, of course. Her fingers flew over the keyboard. Years of field hacking weren't pretty, but they got the job done. Within minutes, the files began copying: convoy manifests, route coordinates, supply drop schedules. And then a noise. Footsteps close, too close. Rivera killed the light and melted into the shadows behind a tall cabinet. The door creaked open, and a soldier stepped inside, humming softly to himself. He was young, maybe 20, maybe less, and tired, dragging his boots as if sleep was pulling him down by the shoulders. He poured coffee from a thermos, yawned, and shuffled out again. Rivera didn't breathe until the door clicked shut. The download completed seconds later. She yanked the drive and slipped out the way she came, heart hammering in her chest. This was it. She had what she needed. But as she crossed the courtyard toward the wall, she heard something that froze her in place. A voice. Familiar, too familiar. "Make sure the trucks are ready by dawn," the man barked in Arabic. "We cross at 600, and if anyone gets in our way, burn them." Rivera pressed herself against the wall and peeked around the corner. Al-Malik. He was here now. For a long, breathless second, Rivera's world shrank to the sight of that face. The same eyes that had stared out from the footage of massacred civilians. The same voice that had haunted her dreams. She could take him now. A clean shot, one squeeze and it would all be over. But no, not here, not yet. The courtyard was crawling with soldiers. Firing now would mean death and worse, failure. So instead she watched, memorized, listened. 3 trucks, Al-Malik continued. 1 decoy, 2 with cargo. I ride in the second. Once we're across, the world will know what we're capable of. Cargo. Rivera's blood turned to ice. This wasn't just a smuggling operation. Something bigger was inside those trucks, something they weren't supposed to get across the border. She slipped back into the shadows, mind racing. She had 2 days to stop them, and now she knew exactly where to strike. The journey back to her hideout was a blur. She moved through the desert like a wraith, adrenaline still burning in her veins. By the time the first pale streaks of dawn brushed the horizon, she was back in the riverbed, staring at the convoy route glowing on her tablet. It wasn't just a road. It was a choke point, a narrow canyon leading to the border bridge, perfect for an ambush or a massacre. Rivera knew she couldn't do this alone, not anymore. She powered up her transmitter and switched to a secure frequency. "This is Spectre," she whispered. "Mission priority is now critical. I need support." There was a long silence. Then Vega's voice crackled through. "Spectre, you're supposed to be dead." "Not yet. Listen carefully. I have Al-Malik's route. He's transporting something dangerous. I'm going to stop him, but I need extraction and overwatch." "Negative," Vega replied. "Your rogue, Rivera, command's orders were clear." "Then disobey them," she hissed. "You owe me that much." A beat, then another. "Finally, send the coordinates." For the first time in weeks, Rivera felt something close to hope. She spent the next 36 hours preparing the canyon, planting explosives in the choke points, setting up firing positions, marking escape routes. Every detail had to be perfect. And all the while, the memories came back, faces of the fallen, the weight of her choices, the ghosts that followed her here. "You could walk away," they whispered. "No one would blame you." But she couldn't, because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about Al-Malik. It was about every life that would be saved if she stopped him, about every innocent who'd never hear the sound of his bombs. It was about redemption. On the morning of the second day, she saw them. 3 trucks rumbling down the desert road just as planned. A dozen armed vehicles in escort, and in the second truck, the man she had chased across continents. Rivera lay prone on the canyon ridge, her rifle steady, her heartbeat calm. "Spectre in position," she whispered, awaiting confirmation. "Overwatch ready," Vega replied. "You've got 2 drones and a QRF 30 minutes out." Rivera nodded. "On my mark." The convoy entered the canyon. Now, the first explosion tore through the sand, flipping the lead truck into the air. The second blast crushed the vehicle behind it, trapping the entire column in a wall of fire and smoke. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked across the canyon. Rivera's rifle barked, dropping targets one by one. A drone screamed overhead, unleashing a hail of suppression fire. Al-Malik's men scattered, shouting orders, returning fire, but they were pinned, confused, blind. Rivera moved like she'd been born for this, every shot precise, every decision calculated. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was judgment. Through the haze of smoke, she saw the second truck's door fly open. Al-Malik stumbled out, coughing, weapon in hand. He looked around wildly, searching for the enemy he couldn't see. Their eyes met across the canyon floor. It was time. Rivera slid down the slope, boots digging into loose rock, rifle ready. The fight closed in around her, muzzle flashes, shouts, the thud of bullets chewing into stone. She advanced without fear, without hesitation. And as she closed the distance, she thought of every life that had led her here. The mistakes, the failures, the promises. This is where it ends. Al-Malik saw her and froze, recognition, anger, fear. You, he spat. Me. They circled each other like predators, weapons raised, the air between them heavy with years of unfinished business. You think killing me will change anything, he sneered. You're too late, the world will burn. Then I'll die putting out the fire. She squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon, a single, perfect sound that seemed to carry every ounce of pain, fury, and hope she'd ever known. Al-Malik fell, and for the first time in years, Rivera felt the weight lift from her chest. The battle wasn't over. His men were still fighting, still resisting, but something fundamental had shifted. Their leader was gone. Their will was broken. Within minutes, the rest surrendered or fled into the desert. Rivera lowered her rifle, breathing hard. Dust swirled around her boots. The silence that followed felt unreal. It was over. Or at least she thought it was. Because as she approached the second truck, a sharp metallic click made her freeze. A timer. A bomb. And the numbers were already ticking down. The sound was faint, but it cut deeper than any bullet ever could. Click, click, click. Rivera's blood ran cold as she stared into the truck's dark interior. Wires, casing, a digital timer glowing red through the smoke, counting down with ruthless precision. 02:43. 2 minutes and 43 seconds. That's all that separated this canyon from oblivion. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Training screamed at her to move, to think, to do something. But for a split second, she couldn't breathe, couldn't blink, couldn't even hear the chaos still raging faintly around her. Vega, her voice trembled as she pressed her comm. We've got a device, high yield, countdowns active. Say again, Spectre. A bomb, she snapped. Big one, 2 minutes 30. There was a pause, the kind that meant bad news. We don't have EOD on site. Best case, 8 minutes out. She looked at the timer again. 02:12. 8 minutes might as well have been forever. Rivera drew a long breath and climbed into the truck. The interior was hot, suffocating, stinking of chemicals and oil. The device sat bolted to the truck floor, crude but powerful. Military-grade explosives, lined with fragmentation casing, wired to a central detonator. It was enough to turn the entire canyon, and anyone within half a mile, into ash. Her hands hovered over the mess of wires. She had basic bomb disposal training, enough to defuse a tripwire, maybe a pressure plate. But this was something else. Her mind raced. Red or blue first? What if there's a trap circuit? What if it's motion triggered? She closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, and in that second her heartbeat steadied. Breathe, Rivera, she whispered. You've done harder things. But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed it. She tore open the panel and began working, wire by wire, circuit by circuit. Sweat streaked down her neck, stinging her eyes. Every second felt like an hour, every breath a prayer. 01:36. Outside, the battle was dying. Vega's quick reaction force had arrived, sweeping up the last of Al-Malik's men. But no one dared approach the truck. They all knew what was inside. Spectre status, Vega's voice crackled in her ear. Working it. Evac the area, that's an order. Negative. Rivera. If this goes, we lose half this region's only crossing point. And if that bridge collapses, thousands of civilians will starve. I'm not leaving. Silence, then a sigh. God damn it, then I'm staying on the line. Rivera allowed herself the smallest of smiles. It helped, hearing another human voice when death was breathing down her neck. She clipped the first wire, no explosion. Then the second, still safe. 00:57. The timer was under a minute now. Her hands shook. The circuits became more complex. Whoever built this had meant for it to kill anyone foolish enough to tamper with it. "Talk to me," Vega said softly. "Keep your head clear." Rivera's mind drifted, not away from the bomb, but backward, to the faces of the people she'd fought for. The child who'd lost his family in the convoy massacre. The villagers who'd hidden her from enemy patrols. The team she'd left behind because of her own guilt. This was why she was here. This was what all of it meant. Not revenge, not even justice. Redemption. 0034. "Final circuit," she whispered. It was a failsafe, a cross-wired loop meant to trigger if the others were cut incorrectly. She studied it for precious seconds, tracing its route with trembling fingers. "Rivera," Vega's voice was tight now. "Time." "I know." She took one last breath, then another. And snipped. The timer froze. 0017. Rivera stared at the silent device for a long, impossible moment. Then she laughed, a weak, breathless sound that was equal parts relief and disbelief. "It's done," she said into the calm. "You did it," Vega breathed. She slumped against the truck wall, chest heaving, eyes burning. For the first time in months, maybe years, the crushing weight on her chest felt lighter. The ghosts were still there, they always would be, but now they were quieter. Because she'd done something that mattered. Hours later, the canyon was a different place. The fires were out. The wounded were evacuated. The captured were being interrogated. And Al-Malik's body was zipped into a black bag, bound for a nameless grave. Rivera stood on the ridge overlooking the wreckage, the rising sun painting the sand in hues of gold and blood. Vega approached silently, handing her a canteen. "You know," he said, "Command is furious with you." She smirked faintly. "They usually are. They also want to bring you back." Her smile faded. "Back." "Special Operations Division, Strategic Counterterror Unit, clean slate, full reinstatement. They say they need people like you." Rivera looked down at the desert below, the place where she'd almost died and almost lost herself. "Do they though?" she murmured. Vega stepped beside her. "I think they do, and I think you need it too." She didn't answer. Not right away. The truth was, she didn't know what she needed. For so long, her entire existence had been about this, chasing Al-Malik, righting a wrong, finishing what she'd started. Now that it was over, who was she? The silence stretched between them until Vega spoke again. "You saved thousands today, Rivera, maybe more. That bomb, it wasn't meant for the bridge." She turned sharply. "What?" "It was meant for a city. Intelligence found documents in the truck, plans to move it into a refugee camp after the border. They would have blamed it on someone else." Her stomach twisted. "A false flag." "Exactly. You didn't just stop a terrorist, you stopped a war." The words hit her harder than any explosion, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. 3 weeks later, the desert was far behind her. The base was cold, steel gray, and sterile, a far cry from the chaos she'd lived in for so long. Rivera sat in the briefing room, her new insignia heavy on her shoulder. Across the table, a handful of officers watched her with a mix of respect and curiosity. "Welcome back, Captain," one of them said. "We have a lot of work ahead of us." Rivera nodded. "I'm ready." But in truth, she was more than ready. She was reborn. This time it wasn't about vengeance, or guilt, or the past. It was about the mission, the real mission. Protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, standing in the gap when no one else would. And maybe, just maybe, finding peace along the way. On her first assignment, she found herself once again in the field, a remote village near a disputed border. Intelligence suggested a splinter cell might try to seize it as a staging ground. She stepped out of the helicopter into the baking sun, the familiar scent of dust and diesel filling her lungs. The villagers watched from a distance, wary, uncertain, afraid. Rivera removed her helmet and knelt beside a young boy who had edged closer than the rest. He looked up at her, wide-eyed. "Are you here to fight?" he asked. She smiled softly. "Only if I have to." "Then why are you here?" She glanced around at the homes made of mud and tin, at the tired faces, at the silent hope hidden behind fearful eyes. "To make sure you get to live," she said. The boy thought about that for a moment, then he grinned. "Then I'm glad you came." Rivera watched him run back to his family, a small laugh escaping her lips. It wasn't the kind of glory they wrote stories about. There were no medals waiting for her at the end of this road. But this quiet, unseen work was why she'd come back. And why she would keep coming back. That night, as the wind whispered across the plains and the stars burned bright over a silent camp, Rivera sat alone by the fire. The weight of her rifle rested against her knee. The ghosts still lingered in the darkness beyond the light. But they no longer haunted her. They walked with her. Because every mistake, every scar, every sleepless night, they had all led her here, to this moment, to this purpose. She stared into the flames, her reflection flickering in the embers, and allowed herself a small, quiet truth. "Sometimes," she whispered into the night, "dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." And with that, Rivera, soldier, hunter, survivor, closed her eyes beneath the vast, forgiving sky. The war wasn't over, it never would be. But for the first time, she was at peace.